I've been coming to Normandy for 20 years and I thought I'd heard all the stories. But tonight you'll see and hear the stories of a group of American paratroopers and French villagers who formed a bond in a time of great peril here 60 years ago. A bond that goes on to this day. This is the D-Day of newsreels and history books. The massive amphibious landing. The heavy bombing. The intense shelling. The legendary invasion that changed the course of the greatest war ever fought.
It's going to live for thousands of years as this flashpoint, this turning point. And the big turning point of it all was D-Day.
But D-Day was something else as well. A battle won by thousands of individual acts of courage, a day of deeply personal stories unfolding within the great sweep of history. Stories such as this one. It takes place in a little French town the war planners didn't even put on their maps. It is a story of American warriors and the people they came to liberate, and how they formed a lifelong friendship through common courage, cunning, and sacrifice. It begins with three men, three among thousands of paratroopers who leaped into history on June 6, 1944, 60 years ago today.
Everybody knew that this was probably the greatest invasion in the history of the world. Morale was high, and people were anxious to close with the enemy.
Back then, Frank Naughton was a 26-year-old lieutenant. Today, he looks every inch like the judge he became after the Army. Ed Barnes was 24. 60 years later, he still proudly fits into his uniform. John Hinchliffe, the youngster, was 22, a machine gunner. His cap proclaims him a member of the 82nd Airborne, the All-American Division.
I think we've done a darn good job. I wouldn't advise anybody to say otherwise.
None of them set out to be a hero. John Hinchliffe joined the Army at age 16 to escape the Great Depression.
And they came around asking for volunteers for the Airborne. We didn't know what Airborne was, really.
Frank Naughton says he volunteered for airborne duty for the promise of adventure and better pay.
We were getting $21 a month, and that promised us an additional $50. I think that had a great deal to do with it.
Ed Barnes was drafted in 1942. His first assignment was to be a bugler in the band.
I wasn't going to join no band. I was rather be in combat. So that's when I volunteered for the Airborne there.
They were all assigned to the 507th Parachute Infantry, activated in July of 1942. John Hinchliffe vividly remembers the day that he showed up for airborne training.
All of a sudden, I see C-47 coming along over on my right, and I was watching it. And all at once, people started flying out the door of that thing. I guess I was a little bit startled, realizing that that's what I was planning on doing.
Hinchliffe, like so many young paratroopers in training, had never even flown in an airplane before. Now he was preparing to jump out of one. Air travel was a novelty then, and the concept of dropping paratroopers behind enemy lines was just a few years old. The new paratroopers had to make things up as they went along, at one point wearing football helmets because regular Army helmets wouldn't stay on. That's Frank Naughton himself, by the way. The American Army was being invented on the move, in effect.
Yes, it was.
What was it about the training that really impressed you, that still lingers with you?
Well, it was rigorous. It was hard training, physical training, but it was a challenge,
2 years of intense training, and then their first real combat jump, one for the ages, D-Day.
One doesn't want to even think about how grim the consequences of defeat in the Battle of Normandy would have been.
Douglas Brinkley is a noted historian of World War II.
It became clear that there was going to be a defining moment when the whole thrust and industrial might of the United States was going to be brought not at the doorstep of Europe, but into Europe. And the question was, would it be enough?
Naughton, Barnes, and Hinchliffe would be part of the largest air and sea invasion ever attempted. 170,000 men assaulting Hitler's fortress Europe. The attack on Normandy, a winner-take-all gamble to break the Nazi stronghold. The paratroopers would jump before dawn, and they knew not everyone would come back. Did you also feel You were young, well trained, but they're not going to get me.
No.
You thought they might, right? For these paratroopers, D-Day and the days after turned out to be a time when almost nothing went as planned. When they came to depend on allies they never knew existed. When they committed themselves to a battle they hadn't trained for in a small town they'd never heard of.
Thousands of airborne troops were going to drop behind enemy lines.
I looked at my watch. It was exactly 1 minute to 12 on the 5th of June. One more minute, and it was D-Day.
John Hinchcliffe, Frank Naughton, and Ed Barnes, 3 paratroopers among 20,000 who took off from England and jumped into the darkness over France before dawn on June 6, 1944. The lightly armed paratroopers had a simple but extremely dangerous assignment from General Dwight Eisenhower: stop a German counterattack on Utah Beach and keep the German forces at the beach from escaping inland.
Eisenhower predicted about 70% of the men might be killed that would go parachute down. Imagine being part of an endeavor where the odds by your leader are telling you 70% of you won't come back alive.
Hinchcliffe remembers a buddy who seemed well aware of the odds.
He came up and I said, Johnny, he said, take as many of them bastards with you, he said, before you go. We fully expected to lose people.
They were overloaded with gear, guns, ammunition, grenades, mines, more than they needed. For some men, the gear weighed almost as much as they did. You got it loaded onto a C-47?
Yes.
Was there a lot of chatter on board, or people?
No, there was not a lot of chatter. Almost none, I would say. Almost none.
Most of the flight was uneventful, but when they crossed into occupied France, the skies around them seemed to explode.
Start getting heavy flak, heavy anti-aircraft fire, and it was coming up. It looked like you could almost stepped out of the aircraft and walk on it. It was so thick and heavy.
Oh, a lot of flak. It was the 4th of July.
Naughton says he wasn't particularly frightened by the anti-aircraft fire, but what happened next shook him.
We hit the fog bank, and you could see nothing, absolutely nothing. The pilot can see no more than you can see. That was the hairy part.
Some of the pilots were on their first combat mission. Many were flying low and fast to get around the anti-aircraft fire. Now, some scattered to avoid hitting each other in the fog. The red light goes to green light inside the C-47.
Yes.
Time to jump.
Yes.
How was your jump?
Rough.
The same time I bailed out, I saw a C-47 to my right, and it was going straight down in flames, completely enveloped. It was a thing I can remember kind of saying a little prayer. I hope those paratroopers got out of that aircraft.
Some paratroopers never reached the ground alive.
Many Germans were alerted to the parachuting in and were just waiting there, just plucking them out of the air as if they were geese in flight, shooting them dead.
Many who survived the gunfire found another deadly surprise waiting. The Germans guessed correctly that the Allies would use paratroopers on D-Day. As a defense, they flooded vast stretches of marshland. Some American soldiers, loaded with gear, got tangled in their parachutes, sank in those marshes, and drowned. Frank Naughton landed in water up to his shoulders. How'd you get unentangled?
One of the good pieces of equipment we had was a knife. I cut myself out of the chute. Yeah.
Machine gunner John Hinchcliffe was lucky to land in shallow water. You still see yourself when you look down this field?
Oh, yeah. Bet your life.
Communications Sergeant Ed Barnes jumped with a 60-pound telephone switchboard strapped to his legs. Landing in deep water probably would have killed him. You got lucky.
Yeah. Oh, I was a lucky boy. As I came down, the canopy of my chute went right over the tree, and it just bent and bent and bent, and it let me down so soft.
The survivors of the jump faced an immediate problem: how to find each other in the dark. They'd been given a password and told to shoot anyone who didn't know it. Naughton remembers hearing, not seeing, someone coming toward him.
Hear somebody splashing, literally splashing towards you. Why?
You remember the password?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
What was it?
The first night, thunder, welcome.
So you shout out thunder?
I shouted thunder. Yes.
And when it came back, the right answer?
And I was also looking into a 45, the barrel of a 45.
He had his
Yeah.
weapon drawn.
Yes, which he should have been.
Right.
But he was looking into a carbine.